Okay, Bob, I just got a message that the video is unavailable for the live stream.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I'm seeing on YouTube it says video is unavailable, but let me try to.
Oh, looks like it just started.
Okay. It says video has been removed by the uploader. It's a new
I think it's
notice for me.
it's spooling up now. There it is.
Okay.
It's live on YouTube now.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay, thanks, Bob. And Kevin Blakely, do you want to try sharing your screen, or do you feel comfortable doing that?
Well, I feel comfortable, but I can give you a test run if you like.
Okay, sure.
He's comfortable. He's just not sure the machine is comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see, I'm looking down here, share screen. What I usually do is share the rules, PowerPoint slideshow. Okay, that should share it there.
Yep, that looks good.
And then should be able to, you could see the slides progress.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, awesome. Thanks for testing that. Hi, Jamie. Welcome.
Hello. Oop, let me get rid of my other background. How are you today, Sam?
Doing well.
Good. How about you, Kevin? How are you?
Hey, doing good, Jamie, thanks. Yourself?
Yeah, doing pretty well. It's hot. I'm down in Mississippi. It's hot down here.
Yeah, hot in a whole different way than here, for sure.
Yeah, I understand it's hot up there. You guys are having another heat wave too.
Yep, a little bit of a heat wave. What are the bugs like down your way?
You know, that's a funny thing you say that. We have not, I mean, I expected them to be a lot worse, but they're really not.
All right, that's
I mean,
good.
it's very humid, but yeah, the bugs really haven't been a problem. Not as bad as, like, you know, Alaska in July and August, where it's so bad. But yeah, we've been seeing lightning bugs even down here, which surprised me this late. I thought they would all be gone by mid-July, but they're still here. Hi, Kevin Christensen.
Hey there.
Thanks so much for joining us and for coordinating with us. You know, between the last meeting and this meeting, everyone's really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So really appreciate you putting together the materials and just doing your best to answer the questions. I'm sure folks will have other questions for you, but I'm glad we could give you a heads up.
No, thank you for that. And
Yeah.
I don't know what the formality is, how the questions are developed, you know, outside of the working group. But I have, you know, some responses that I can probably provide in just a written format, given
Yeah.
in a time frame, we're probably not likely to hit or cover all the questions that
Right.
you provided in writing, let alone what gets asked in person. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's really up for you to say, because, but yeah, anything that you could do in writing, I think that group would really appreciate. So thank you, thank you.
And I see we have a caller with the last 4 digits, 1398, who's joining us by phone.
That's Isaac Sear with State Police.
Hi,
Hi.
Sergeant Sear. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hey, Isaac, are you able to be on video too?
Not today. It's my day off and I'm at home, so I'd rather just call in.
Okay. And Isaac, thank you for renaming yourself too, so everybody knows who you are.
Oh, I didn't realize.
That was me.
What's that?
Oh, did you do that,
Oh, that
Sam?
was you.
Yeah.
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 Some of the powers
that.
of being the host, I can rename people.
Yeah. And so we've got Stan here as well. So so Isaac, you and I had talked this morning about you taking the lead on just, you know, giving an overview of the wildlife division, your role in checking trap check times, you know, challenges and opportunities that you find. I mean, it really is. You all know all this stuff. You do it every day, so it's really more just talking off the top of your head about you know, what the division does and the kinds of things that you see and challenges and opportunities that are out there. And then Stan, you know, we had talked to Stan about providing some of that, and then thought it would be helpful to have a current OSP officer or trooper rather be in that role. But Stan can provide some additional information about training, because he provides training to OSP, and then potentially a historical perspective, since he's retired now but served on as a wildlife trooper for 25 years. So you guys are kind of sharing the time just a little bit.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, but we're going to look to you, Isaac, to start things off, and Stan's going to be looking to you to answer the questions. Does that sound good, Stan?
Okay.
I'm with you.
Okay.
Has this working group been going for a while or?
No, they've had 2 meetings.
Okay, all right, yeah. Just because I'm new to it, so I'm not, this will be the first time today, so.
Yeah, and so we'll have folks introduce themselves, especially since you're on the phone. I don't know that you're looking at a computer that you can see everybody's names, but
No,
if you're just calling, yeah, if you're just calling in, then we'll have folks introduce yourself so you have themselves so that you have a better sense of who's in the room.
okay.
Hey, Tyler.
Hey there, how's it going? I'll come on here in just a second.
Okay.
Hi, Lauren. Welcome. Hi, Amy. Welcome.
Hi, I'm just going to be quietly in the corner for this one.
Sounds good.
Okay.
And
Hopefully you're not.
welcome.
Hopefully you're not actually in a corner.
No, but I did just come in from the garden, so it's probably good to be camera off and sitting in the corner for this one.
Ah, I understand.
And
Hi, Jill.
Welcome, Jill.
I sure like that wallpaper. You're on mute, but it's a really colorful room. You're still muted, Jill. There you
Yeah.
go.
Good morning or afternoon. Good afternoon there.
Yep.
I got caught up.
So is that paint or is that wallpaper?
That's paint.
Ah,
And yeah, very exacting to make those straight lines.
I bet.
Yeah, I didn't do it. Somebody else did. But yeah, you had to use a plumb line. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's my daughter's old room.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. We just use it for visitors and Zoom calls.
Who would have thought we would need a Zoom room in our home?
Right.
Hmm.
And hi, Jeffrey. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you as well. Our group is coming together.
It's like
Sam, have we heard?
Derek is still here.
I think Derek left and came back. Sam, have we heard from anybody who can't be here today?
I know Bob was tentative, so I'm not sure if he will be able to join us.
Okay. Yeah, Bob Salinger.
Yep, Bob Salinger. And hi, Greg. Hi, Susan. Welcome. Hi, Shannon.
Hi, Jamie. Hi, Sam.
Hello.
Just finishing a couple of bites of lunch, so I'm going to go off video again.
Hi, Kelly. Welcome.
Hi there. Thank you.
Hi, Jim. Can you hear us okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Great. Welcome. And hi, Kyle. Good afternoon.
Hi, everybody. Finding the right button to punch here. There I am.
Are we expecting Stan?
Stan Steele?
Yes.
Yes, he is. He is here for just a little bit of a backup to our OSP officer,
All right.
who is taking the lead on our enforcement presentation and conversation.
Okay. I know Stan had a lot of interest in this.
Kyle, quick question. Is Marianne planning to join us today?
I thought she was. I talked to her an hour ago and I thought she was.
Okay, maybe she's be hopping on any minute. And welcome, Bob. Welcome, Quinn.
Thanks. I'm having like awful connection problems today, so I may try and put the video on, but I seem to lose it pretty fast.
No problem. Thank you for being here. So we have nearly everyone except for Marianne. So I think we're ready to get started.
Okay.
Do I have to do something to get my picture up there, or maybe nobody wants it actually?
Jim.
I'll help you out, Jim.
All you have to do, Jim, is turn your video on. You can just go to the bottom of your screen. There's a a little video camera, and there might be a red X or a red line through it, and you just have to tap that and turn that on so we can see you. There you are.
Okay.
See, we're happy to see you.
Okay. Well, surprised me.
Okay, Sam. Here we are. Well, welcome everybody to our, gosh, this is our third trap check meeting, and we're scheduled to go till 4 o'clock. We've got the agenda here in just a minute, and I would think it would be helpful for us to do just a quick round of introductions. We have a number of guests today because of the agenda, and it would help them if they knew who were primary and alternate, and it'd help everybody to know who the guests we have are. So I'm Jamie Damon. I'm the facilitator from Kearns and West, and with me is Sam. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, you've received many emails from me. I'm Sam Mason. I'm an associate with Kearns and West.
Thanks, Sam. And then let's hear from our commissioners. We've got Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Yes, hi, I'm Jill Zarnowitz, and Commissioner on ODFW's commission in the District 1.
Great. And then Commissioner Woolley.
I was muted. Greg Woolley, Vice Chair of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Commission.
Great, thank you. And then let's hear from our ODFW staff. We've got Shannon.
Yeah.
There we go. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, this is Shannon Hearn, Deputy Director for Fish and Wildlife Programs. I'm actually going to be the secondary today. Kevin will be the primary. I got to step away a few times, plus he's presenting. So he'll be in the lead seat for the one we share.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Kevin?
Afternoon, everybody. Kevin Blakely. I'm the Deputy Wildlife Division Administrator with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Kevin. Derek?
Good afternoon. I'm Derek Broman. I'm the Carnivore Fur Bearer Coordinator for ODFW.
Thanks, Derek. Then let's go ahead and move to our work group members. I'm going to start with Tyler.
Hey everyone, yeah, Tyler Dungannon, Conservation Coordinator for the Oregon Hunters Association.
And Tyler's our primary, and we also have Amy here, and she's just in listening mode. And then let's move to Kelly.
Hi there, I'm Kelly Peterson. I'm the Oregon State Director for the Humane Society of the United States.
Thank you, Kelly. And Kelly, your alternate is?
Susan Getty, and I did see her here. There she is.
Yep, she's here and listening. So Susan is an alternate. Let's see who to go to next. Jim, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Jim Soares, Vice President of the Oregon Trappers Association.
Welcome, Jim. And your alternate's not here today, I don't think.
No, I don't see him there.
Yeah, I don't see him either. Quinn, welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Quinn Reed. I'm the Oregon Policy Director for the Center for Biological Diversity. And Susan is also very graciously my alternate. So I just want to make sure folks know she's serving that role for both Kelly and I. Thank
Susan
you.
Is a double alternate. Thanks,
yes.
Quinn. Let's see, Bob.
Hi, Bob Solinger, Portland Audubon Society.
And Bob is primary. And then Mary Ann.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mary Ann Cooper with the Oregon Farm Bureau Federation. My alternate is Kyle Williams. I don't think he is on today. And sorry, oh, there he is. Sorry, Kyle. And I'll be on video here in a moment. I'm just wrapping up some lunch. I apologize, very late lunch.
No worries. Thanks, Mary Ann. And Lauren?
Hi, I am Lauren Smith. I'm a Legislative Affairs Manager at the Association of Oregon Counties. I apologize for my video being off. My internet is being wonky today, so I'm trying to make sure I can hear all of you.
No worries. Thanks for that clarification. And then just for clarification, we always invite our alternates. They're welcome to be in the room with all of us. We ask that alternates not participate in the conversation. And they all know that. And then we have a number of presenters. And we'll have them introduce themselves when we get to their point on the agenda. So let's go ahead and put the agenda up. Actually, before that, just a couple Zoom meeting tips. I know we're all old hands at this, but if people can keep themselves muted and stay on video, that would be great. And everyone's connected by audio appropriately. And I think that's about it. If you have any difficulties, you can text Sam at the number here on the screen, 360-356-3660. Hey, Bob, you are not on mute. There, can you go ahead and mute yourself? Or Sam, maybe you can. Yep. And then when we get to a place on the agenda where we've got, where we're asking people to get in the queue because you've got questions, we ask that you raise your hand so that way we know where you are. If your video is off, we'll ask that you turn your video on, but it's good to keep your video on, through the meeting if you can. It's only 2 hours.
And just
Okay,
one thing to note for Isaac, that if you would like to unmute yourself, if you've been muted for background noise, you've just pressed *6, so you can unmute yourself. Just a little reminder there.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Because he's calling in. Oh, just a reminder about the views. I think we all know this. It looks like everybody has renamed themselves, so we're good there. Go ahead and go to the next slide and the agenda. So we've done our introductions, done a few welcomes. So we have two big topics and then a couple of carryover pieces from previous meetings. So the one big topic is our APHIS Wildlife Services and Wildlife Control Operators presentation and conversation. You can see we have Kevin Christensen and Jeffrey Flores. Is it Flores?
Yes,
Yep.
correct.
Great. I want to make sure I pronounced it right. With Wildlife Services. We have sent them all of your questions in advance. They've done their best to try to organize their presentation around your questions. And then we'll have time for questions and answers as well. And then Kevin Blakely has some information to share as well from the Wildlife Control Operators perspective. So that's a big chunk of our meeting. And then folks at the last meeting had asked about having a conversation with Oregon State Police about Wildlife Division enforcement of trap check times and what they're seeing on the ground, challenges and opportunities around that, and just be available for questions. We weren't sure if we would be able to have somebody on board from who's current with OSP, and we do now today. We have Sergeant Isaac, where are you? Sear. Is that right, Isaac? Am I pronouncing it right? Is it Sear?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Sergeant Isaac Sear with Oregon State Police Wildlife Division, and he's out of Baker City, and he'll introduce himself a little bit more when we get to that point. And he's calling in today. Today's his day off. And so he doesn't have a presentation to share, but he's going to talk about his experiences from the field and be available for questions. We did send him questions in advance, and so he's aware of the kinds of questions people have. I had contacted Stan Steele, who sits on our Beaver work group, prior to us being able to get in touch with somebody from OSP. Stan and I have talked. He is here. And he has a teeny bit to share about the training side because he is a current trainer with OSP. And so Stan has joined us for that part of Isaac's presentation. And then we've got to finalize the draft charter and review the draft work plan. That's a carryover from the last meeting. People have had a chance to look at that in advance. And we need to tee up what our next steps for our next meeting is, which is in September. And then confirm what's happening between now and then to prepare for that meeting. And we'll be done at 4. So that is our agenda for today. A few meeting guidelines. These come from our charter. We ask people to fully participate in work group meetings. People have come prepared for meetings, obviously. You're here. to participate in an open and mutually respectful way. A balance of speaking time, meaning if you're speaking too much, we ask that you make space for other people to speak, and I'll be watching that as well. And also, if you're not saying anything, I mean, this is people want to hear what everyone has to say. That's why we're a work group. So please chime up. And that is for primaries. And to serve as a liaison to the larger community of interest and act in good faith. So those are our meeting guidelines, which I believe brings us to our first presentation. So Jeffrey and Kevin, if you want to more completely introduce yourselves, and I think Sam has given you screen sharing capability, and so you're on. And just one other thing for Jeffrey and Kevin. So are you asking to hold, should we do your two and then hold questions towards the end so that you can get through all your material? That's what I would suggest.
Yeah. I think we're open to that suggestion.
Yeah, and I think we probably want to pause after you and ask any additional questions, and then Kevin will turn to you and have you share your information and then ask questions of you after yours. Okay, just want to make sure everybody knows when they can participate. All right, Kevin, Jeffrey, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much. Jeff, do you want to provide an introduction to yourself?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be part of the meeting today. I've originally been working as a state director for the Guam program. I've been here for 22 some years. I accepted the position as the Oregon State Director back in, I think it was sometime in July. And my first day was last week. And so excited to be a part of the Oregon program, seeing what everyone does on the ground and get a chance to learn from everyone. Kevin's going to do most of the speaking. We were able to work together on our responses with regard to the questions that you provided us. And so he'll be handling majority of the meeting since he's been with the program for 13 years. So I'll be mostly in listening mode, and as needed, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to chime in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Kevin Christensen, Assistant State Director for Wildlife Services. As Jeff said, I've been here for 13 years and with Wildlife Services for about 22, 23 years. Really appreciate the opportunity. There's been a lot of questions asked, and so we understand that there's a desire to have Wildlife Services on, and we appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to start the screen share. I've got a short presentation. Is everyone seeing that now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just to give a little bit of background for Wildlife Services, we received about 26 plus questions from the working group, and I may not be able to address all those, but we have written responses. So if there's questions that we don't have time to get to today, that we can provide a written response for those questions afterwards. Wildlife Services has a long history, over 100 years of developing over time. There's been a lot of methods and efforts throughout the country in all aspects of wildlife management to refine and to the point of what we understand today. One of the benefits of science is that you always have the benefits of what you learned yesterday for the things that you're doing today. And that's certainly the case with Wildlife Services over the years in our history. One of the primary authorities that Wildlife Services has comes from the Animal Damage Control Act, 1931. And the short takeaways from those is Wildlife Services is a service agency. We're here to provide services upon request and to be subject matter experts in resolving wildlife conflicts. Our overall mission for Wildlife Services is to provide that leadership in helping to resolve wildlife conflicts and to allow people to coexist with wildlife. Wildlife Services has a research division, the National Wildlife Research Center, that's kind of one of a kind in researching and developing methods and refining methods for dealing with wildlife conflicts. And that's a key and integral part to Wildlife Services operations, and it will be part of the discussion as I respond to some of the questions. One of the key questions asked for us for Wildlife Services is what kind of activities do we do? most everyone is familiar with the lethal component of the services that we provide, but we provide a very integrated wildlife damage management approach, looking at all of our available options and trying to find the best available solutions given unique circumstances and scenarios that we encounter. And we work to cover, an array of resources, including agricultural, property, human health and safety, and as well as natural resources. We have specific programs within wildlife services across the nation. One of those is within our aviation to reduce conflicts to aviation and public safety. A national feral swine program trying to address feral swine conflicts. We're an emergency response for hazards involving wildlife, such as oil spills and other types of emergencies. Wildlife disease surveillance throughout the country. And we certainly work with the Fish and Wildlife and other agencies on protecting teenage species. All right, so I need to go back to stop sharing. Sam, can you take care of that? Can't seem to get back to, oh, right there, stop sharing. Perfect. So some of the questions that we received from the committee, and just starting, on the context, Wildlife Services operates currently this new county year, July 1. We'll have regular reoccurring programs in 24 of the 36 counties, where we'll have employees stationed and providing, regular responses. But we do work in the other counties as requested. Those employees report to 3 district offices, one in the Northwest out of Salem, one in Roseburg for the Southwest, and our Eastern office is in La Grant. Key topic or question that came up is, what does Wildlife Services do for trap checks? And in the last working group, Derek Bruin outlines a fairly lengthy discussion as far as the trap check requirements, and Wildlife Services follows those. Wildlife Services has a number of policies or directives in which we follow, one of which is to follow appropriate federal and state laws and regulations. So Wildlife Services follows the predatory animal, fur bearer, unprotected mammal, as well as game species requirements. One question that came up in particular was discussed last time as well, as in particular for bears and cougars. Since they're game species, they don't have a specified trap check requirement. But Wildlife Services does have an intergovernment agreement, an IGA, with ODFW. And ODFW has specified specific requirements in that agreement. And for bears and cougars, it's a 48-hour check. And when assisting ODFW with wolf management, it's a 24-hour check. The question was asked about the types of traps Wildlife Services use, and the reference that I'll provide is a link to the most recent published literature for the BMPs, Best Management Practices, and that would be White et al. 2020. 2021 came out in December. That document outlines a lot of the trap types that have been looked at for the research and categorizes them based upon the types that they are, the various jaws configuration, jaw spreads, and so forth. And so that would be a good reference. That is largely what we're using. Obviously, as we continue to incorporate new equipment, we're replacing old equipment and stocking ourselves with those things that are currently available. One of the other questions about traps is how often that we use traps. For Wildlife Services methods, in all the activities that we deployed where there is a form of take can be lethal take, but it also includes our hazing or harassment, our released, dispersed, any of those types of activities that is a take. For fiscal year 16 to 20, trapping methods accounted for only 1% of all the methods that we deployed. And when it comes to specific trap types, cage traps, wire type cage trap, live trap, constitutes about 24% of the time in our use. Killing traps about 37%, and then restraining traps, such as a foothold trap, for about 39% of the time. The question about what types of methods do we use? Do we teach landowners how to avoid issues and so forth? Ultimately, yes, we do offer a fully integrated wildlife program. When we get to when we provide a response to a resource owner, one of our first thing is to go through a decision model, Wildlife Services decision model, as part of one of our directives, which helps us to identify what the need is, what the damage, and what the options are. It also identifies that we're to focus and emphasize on non-lethal measures. What can we do to help the landowner prevent the problem, to avoid the problem, or resolve the problem without the need of removal? And so we provide a lot of recommendations. We also provide demonstrations, teaching them how to improve methods that they might be implementing. In addition, that we also will then refer or give them ideas for methods that they haven't used. For example, for that same time frame, fiscal year 16 to 20, or that 5-year spread, Wildlife Services reported an average of around 1,000 technical assistance to various resource owners. In those, we recommended over 2,100 types of methods, integrated wildlife management methods for them to implement, in addition to the methods that they were already conducting themselves. A lot of resource owners have already tried a lot of things prior to getting to Wildlife Services. And so we acknowledge the effort that they made with what they've been using, help them to refine how they might use it better or differently, and then the things that they can incorporate in addition to that. Probably the next big topic revolves around humaneness in removing animals and AVMA standards. The question was for Wildlife Services is, do we follow the AVMA euthanasia guidelines for each species? Wildlife Services follows the AVMA recommended euthanasia procedures when feasible to minimize pain and suffering. The AVMA 2020 notes, quote, it may still be an act of euthanasia to kill an animal in a manner that is not perfectly humane or that would not be considered appropriate in other contexts. For example, due to the lack of control over free-ranging wildlife and the stress associated with close contact, human contact, the use of a firearm may be the most appropriate means for euthanasia. Also, shooting a suffering animal that is in extremis, including the catching and transporting it to a clinic to euthanize it, using a method normally considered to be appropriate, is considered, with one interpretation, a good death. The former method promotes the animal's overall interest in ending its misery quickly, even through the latter technique, may be considered to be more acceptable under normal conditions. APHIS Wildlife Services policy is to operate and procedurally fully comply with these guidelines, and APHIS Wildlife Services recognizes the importance of careful decision-making in field regarding the use of lethal methods. Relating to animal injuries, we would reference again the literature from White et al. 2020, the updated BMP guidelines. And we don't necessarily agree that time in a trap correlates directly to injuries based on the available data and peer-reviewed literature. White stated, it may be tempting to assume that average injury scores are positively correlated with the time spent in a trap, but data are extremely limited. Based on observed restraint behavior described above in their literature, injury occurrence must be mostly likely in the first hours of capture. And again, when humans approach to dispatch or release the animal, which would occur regardless of trap check intervals. Although it may not be appropriate to assume animal movement is required to cause trap-related injury. The authors also go on to state that furthermore, trap check intervals does not equate with time spent in a trap. With a 48-hour trap check requirement, a captured animal will still have been in the trap for only 6 hours prior to the trap inspection. So when Wildlife Services implements our efforts, we're looking very closely to the science that's available and utilizing these BMPs as our guiding principles, as well as our policies and directives, which I have listed here that I'll provide afterwards, several references for taking into consideration those aspects. There was a question about, do we have animal welfare focused policies like not trapping in temperature extremes or requiring worry toys inside live traps, or to give occupants a safe alternative to chewing on the metal trap. Do you have a policy about not having metal baits like cat food cans inside of traps? Our goal is to address the concerns of damage by following our Wildlife Services decision model, including in the decision matrix is considering how to address the damage, including determining the ideal locations of setting traps. Wildlife Services employees are trained to consider animal welfare when setting traps, and this includes trap placement, availability of food and water, cover, as well as the security of the trap to prevent the trapped animal from being susceptible to predation or human disturbance. Wildlife Services has not assessed the negative or positive impacts of worry toys in particular that they would have on capture rates or for the potential reduction in injuries. We don't currently have a policy on metal baits. However, we are willing to explore alternatives to this type of bait delivery system. A question that also came up was, what are the protocols when you find live animals in a trap? In short, our policy is animals that are targeted for lethal removal would be dispatched immediately and removed from the capture device and properly disposed of. We have several policies stating to that. What do we do when we take non-target wildlife? And what is the survivability of those non-target wildlife? Non-target animals captured when legal to do so, and when possible, due to the safety and health of the employee and the wildlife, are released. In that 5-year span of data from FY16 to 20, looking at all trapping methods, the average annual non-target capture was an average of 2% of all of our total captures. So only 2% was non-target captures. And essentially half of those end up being released. So our unintentional or non-target take, lethal take, is only 1% of our overall capture, which is about 36 individual animals per year. And I think an important subject that gets to the question, what are the types of challenges faced with different intervals for traps across different terrain, different species, and different settings? Animals respond differently. An individual animal will respond differently and will also respond differently in different environments. So selecting for specific and innovative animals when we're trying to address a specific problem and targeting a specific animal, it can be challenging because you have such variability in how they may respond. A coyote in an urban area is likely to be more tolerant of human disturbance or stimuli, ground disturbance and putting a trap. Whereas a coyote in a rural setting or out in the woods, so to say, is going to be much more responsive to that stimuli or that disturbance and may be shy from that area for a time. It is possible to catch a coyote or other wildlife in a trap on the first night that the trap is set, but that is generally not the case. And actually, in a conversation with Derek Roman and kind of reviewing the recreational fur harvest, the catch per unit effort for coyotes was 1.3 coyotes for every 100 nights. So if I did my math right, that's more around 77, 78 nights to catch a coyote. So I think that puts it in perspective when you look at the amount of effort that goes into be able to capture wildlife. That it has to, you have to have time. You have to have time to be in the right place where the animal is going to be, where the animal is going to have the interest. There's also been studies to show that have made observations of coyotes in particular approaching novel trap sites and how phobic they are of those sites. And actually it takes multiple incursions where they continually work to get closer and closer to that lure or bait before they catch themselves in the trap. When you couple that then with looking at addressing damage and conflicts, again, Wildlife Services has approximately about 36 employees, field employees scattered throughout the state, and addressing damage, we're responding to damage in any given location. And so that's large geographic areas where you're setting specific traps in one location, then maybe traveling to the opposite end of the county to address another current damage. often hours behind locked gates or unimproved roads, or sometimes even using other sources like mules or horses to be able to gain access to areas. And so when you look at the diversity of where and how we trap in responding to damage complaints, it adds a lot of complexity to that timing and interval that it takes to be able to capture animals. There was several questions asked kind of related specific to beavers, but I wasn't sure if this was actually the group or forum where you wanted to. So knowing that we're kind of time sensitive, I want to give Kevin Blakely time to share information about the wildlife control operators. I guess I'd ask Jamie, do you want me to pause here, see if there's particular questions that working group members want me to ask? And also realize that I'll provide written responses to the 26 questions that we received.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I do think we probably should pause and open it up for questions from the group, and then we'll get to Kevin. We have until 3, right around 3 for this whole agenda item. So group members, primaries, if you want to raise your hand, either physically on the screen or just using the raise your hand function. If you've got any question, what questions do you have for Kevin that have come up? Greg?
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Kevin, for that presentation. I just wanted to get that author again of the paper that you were quoting from that talked about, or said they didn't draw a correlation with injury, with the time in the trap, the extent of the injury, and also that animals would stay in a trap an average of 6 hours and so on. So I just wanted to, that was one of my questions.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Woolley. It's White et al., 2020. It's the best management practice update. I have a link, so the PDF that I will send will have a link to a site where you can download and view that article.
Okay, thank you. Another question. So you mentioned that of the non-target, that those 2% non-target, half aren't released. So are those not released because they're too injured to survive and then they're euthanized? What happens with those?
More commonly, they're not released because they were caught in a kill device, a neck snare or another device as a quick killing device. So they're not released because of that. There are some that might not be released because of injuries. Okay,
and then lastly, so you mentioned coyotes. So if a coyote, if you have someone trying to trap a coyote, and you said there's some challenge to that because they're pretty smart animals. If they just see the coyote, can they just shoot it and they'll count that as a take for the landowner? I mean, for your purposes of your work?
For wildlife services, yes, and often we can resolve the conflict with firearms. And usually when we go to a damaged situation, we assess what's going on and what the needs are. If there is a need for lethal action, we will often attempt to try to call that coyote. If there is a damaged conflict where there's active predation, we usually find that those predatory animals are still close by. And if so, we can use sounds, mimic the coyotes, either the calling or pray to draw them in and see if we can shoot them with a firearm. And that often resolves the conflict without the need to utilize traps.
All right.
And so all of our take is reported in our database. That was a question that was asked that I didn't speak to, but yes, all of our activities, our physical activities and take is recorded by our employees into an electronic database that reports the day, the property, the methods used, the animals that are taken.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Kevin. That's all I have for now.
Okay, Kelly, you're up.
You're on mute, Kelly.
There you go. Oh, one more time. There you go.
Okay. Am I muted still? You can hear me?
No, you're good.
Okay. That's so weird. It just said I was muted. So, okay, great. Is it possible to get, Kevin, thank you for the presentation. Is it possible to get a copy of your decision model, your matrix that you use? Is that something you're going to be sharing, or is that something? Yeah, I wanted to ask the two questions. That
To answer that question, yes, I actually have a link where
Great.
all of our directives are available.
Great.
And so in that document that I'll share with you, we'll have a link so that you can view all of our directives.
Okay.
And specifically the ones that I referenced.
Okay. And then, and I've heard this before about coyotes, just over the years here in Oregon, in terms of trap check times. But I do know from our research and other research that there are at least 35 other states that have 24-hour trap check times, and including for coyotes. And I'm assuming then Wildlife Services abides by those laws, those rules that are set forth in other states like Arkansas and otherwise. And they're trapping for coyotes in those states as well. How are coyotes caught? I mean, using that logic, if you have 24-hour trap check times and you're saying, and Wildlife Service is saying, is that they don't come to the trap, but for, 24 hours, that just seems just not like a consistent argument. So I just wanted to put that out there.
No, I appreciate the question, Kelly. It is a good question. When you look at wildlife, again, predictability of wildlife, we do our best as biologists to understand patterns of behavior, but you seldom are ever going to know the behavior of a specific individual, right? When you look at trap checks across other states, I can't speak to other states in particular, other than the states that I've worked in. And anyone by law, following law, is left to work within the confines of the law. It doesn't mean that it's efficient or effective. And as I stated originally, you can catch coyotes overnight. And Jim here is an expert trapper, as well as Stan. Others that, they can attest to the fact that yes, you can and do catch coyotes or other wildlife overnight and in short durations. Again, it's looking at the statistics though, of just like the statistics show that you're going to put more traps out and they're going to soak, so to say, for a longer period of time to have that same catch rate. Can you refine that, expedite it? You do all the things that you can to make it as good as possible. But ultimately you're left to the confines of that. And I would say that individuals still are catching coyotes or other wildlife in shorter trap check intervals, but it does add some complexity. And you do also then are left with, sometimes there's coyotes or wildlife that you can't catch because they are wise, they are trap wise. And on shorter intervals where you're going back to the set repeatedly, that can kind of impede some of that progress. And so folks are left working within the constraints that they have.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Kelly. Jill, your hand was up next, and then Marianne is on deck.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, and one, I've tried to trap, this is just a comment, trap rats, and they're pretty smart too. you have to kind of lure them in over time. But the other question is, you said you have the database, and this one is probably to ODFW. Do we include that database when we're looking at how many animals were trapped or taken, such as specific fur bearers?
I can try to answer that question. I think Commissioner Zarnowitz, you're talking about, do we present or do we use that information to evaluate our fur taker harvest?
Yeah.
And yes, we do. And in fact, that's actually in our commission packet. There are probably now about 20 different appendices in the back of that commission packet that presents an enormous amount of information. And for, I think we have maybe, might only be like 8 primary fur bearer species or animals that are taken. We present data on animals trapped or treed or harvested per usually like 100 trap nights, 100 days hunting. So that's that catch per unit effort information that Kevin was citing before. So yeah, that's enormously valuable because from the wildlife research, wildlife management perspective, harvest is only one number. Catch per unit effort can give us that indication of how much work went into that. Is harvest a reflection of people trying harder or is it an indication of potential population trends one way or the other? So certainly, indeed, we use all that information.
Okay.
Commissioner Zarnowitz, I would just also confirm on that. Looking at, likewise for wildlife services, we go to ODFW to get all forms of mortality, known mortality for the species that we are looking at as we do our environmental analysis. And so we're incorporating all the known take as we do our analysis as well. So it goes both ways, where Derek and I are sharing back and forth.
Okay, great. That's good to know. And then does APHIS use non-employee licensed trappers sometimes?
Good question, one that was asked, Commissioner Zarnowitz. No, we do not. Wildlife Services Authority as a response agency, we essentially don't subcontract out. Wildlife Services assumes the liability responsible for employees only.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Kevin. Marianne, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for joining us today. I was just interested, and I guess specifically as it relates to trapping, given the nature of this work group, is kind of the breakdown between what you term as more rural work and more urban work, and if that influences, you know, how frequently how that work is done. Because I was looking at some of the trapping, you know, aside from coyotes that have a high number, it's, you know, nutria, possum, raccoons, skunks, squirrels. I'm guessing a lot of those are trapping that's like ravens were a few of them that occur in more urban settings, but just wanted to kind of see if you had any sense of the breakdown between, you know, kind of what you term more rural and more urban work as it relates to use of traps.
Thank you, Marianne. Hopefully I understand your question correctly. I would categorize and say the effort, and I will use an example of a coyote. I've worked with Bob Salinger for years, urban coyote issues, and sometimes there's a need to remove coyotes that are threatening people or pets. The effort sometimes to remove one coyote in an urban area would supersede by far the effort that it might take to remove a coyote in a rural area. Just for that reason, it's in an urban area. It's going to be a high visibility area, a high people pet conflict area, a lot of traffic with people, and a lot more areas where you don't have open areas to just find a coyote in a secure location. And so you're left really working in the confines of a very small, narrow box. And so even though there might be fewer circumstances, depending on the county, where we deal with a lot of urban interface type wildlife conflicts, they certainly can be very labor intensive in those efforts. Did I hit to your question, Marianne? Was there another aspect to that?
More the breakdown of, because it looks, you know, for the species that you do trapping on, do you feel like that it's, what do you have a sense of the division between kind of urban and rural, like how often those calls are made for those species where it's more urban or more rural? It sounds like urban can often be a lot more work. So it sounds like the workloads, you know, the division is one thing, but I think I'm thinking in terms of number of species, just what's the breakdown in urban and rural work that y'all do? I think people think of wildlife services as rural, and sometimes I look at some of the species you're trapping and I'm like, you wouldn't trap those in a rural area. You know, those are primarily urban species.
Right. I'll need to get back to the working group on maybe statistics as far as a percentage goes. We have a number of counties that is certainly in here on the western side of the state that it is a lot of urban interface, and it might even be hobby farms. You know, someone that has a small flock of 5 or 6 lambs, maybe a llama. And so there's a lot more of that in the western side of the state. And so there's a huge amount of urban interface, urban suburban interface, where we do a lot of those work. And again, it's the smaller the confines, the more challenging it can be to work in those parameters. But yeah, I'll have to get back to you as far as a percentage of what that looks like.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Jim. Thanks, Marianne. Hey, Jim, I saw you waving. Did you have something to add to that urban rural question that Marianne asked?
Well, not to that. I was going to respond to something Kelly had said earlier about 36 states having a 24-hour trap check. Most of those states are eastern states to begin with. And secondly, Wildlife Services works under the Department of Agriculture, not the state regulations regarding fur bearers. So, you know, that's apples and oranges she's talking about there.
Okay, thanks for that, Jim. Greg, you had a question, and then we probably should turn to Kevin because he's got some information to share, and we're coming up to the top of the hour here in about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks. There's just a little bit aside, but Kevin, since your presence has been requested by some of the members of our committee, I was wondering, based on what you've learned about the purpose of our committee, do you feel that you feel a need to attend all of our meetings as a regular member? Or do you feel that the presentation and question and answer kind of on a one time, and then maybe again, if needed or requested, it is sufficient? I mean, it's been kind of an ongoing question. So I just wondering what you thought in terms of, you know, the expertise that you bring. You know, do you feel that should be an ongoing, you know, every few weeks sort of a presence, or not?
I appreciate the question, Commissioner Woolley. I would say yes, and just reviewing the first two working groups, Wildlife Services or questions were asked in the direction of Wildlife Services that we would have been able to respond to, you know, in a timely fashion. You know, and so I think just given that, the scope of the conversations and the questions that I've scratched through today probably aren't even getting close to the bottom of those questions that folks are having and would like to discuss. So Wildlife Services is a service agency. We would welcome the opportunity to be available to respond to questions.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Any other questions for Kevin at this time before we move to Kevin Blakely? Other Kevin? All right, well, seeing none, thank you, Kevin Christensen and Jeffrey, for joining us. Kevin Blakely, you have some information to share.
Want to make sure the screen share is working. Does that look good, Jamie?
Yep, it looks good and we can hear you good.
Okay, perfect. I'll move right into the presentation. Apologize that Rick Boatner, he's our invasive species wildlife integrity coordinator, not able to be here today. He's on the road doing some training for our boat inspection stations, doing some personnel hiring there. So I'll just start with a very brief background on how the wildlife control operator rules were developed, and I'll likely use the acronym WCO a couple times, and that's what I'm referring to, wildlife control operators, to that program. The, you know, as Derek kind of outlined, the wildlife damage control statutes, they were really designed to deal and really directly address agricultural livestock damage, a lot of that in rural or in that urban-rural interface area. That statute authority that was granted to the department and then, you know, directed us to work with landowners, really designed to address and those agricultural and forest landowners in that balance with wildlife populations and wildlife management. A number of years ago, there's just with all the increases in urban population growth and different interaction with wildlife, everybody's want to, you know, live in their own slice of heaven. Some of those urban populations and wildlife human conflicts associated with that really pointed out some need to better address some of the conflict that was happening with nuisance wildlife, for instance. So in 2003, there was a Senate bill that created a task force that was addressed to look at wildlife control operator activities. That purpose was to make a recommendation for development of a system for licensing and regulating businesses conducting nuisance, damage, or public health risk issues. And prior to that, certainly the department did address those kind of nuisance wildlife and interactions with residents more than agricultural practices and crop damage, those sorts of things. But the capacity to deal with those requests was very limited. And many districts were saying, you know, we could not help you. We could not loan out enough traps. We were pointing them in directions, and really some dissatisfaction by the general public for addressing some nuisance wildlife. So after that Senate bill then in 2004, there was a task force appointed by the director. That task force made 16 recommendations for rule development. And much of that membership of that task force is some of the same membership in this work group today. And recommendations, they were presented to the Legislative Interim Committee. And then also in September of 2004, or that was in September 2004. And then in January 2005, those same findings and refinements presented to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. In 2006, an 11 group task force took those 16 recommendations and in a kind of an internal group along with OSP and again, some of the same membership, created the Division 435 rules that were adopted at that time. And then since 2006, some of those rules had become a little bit outdated, needed to be some adaptive management to those. There had also been some other subsequent rules that needed to align. So there was some additional amendments made then. And in 2014, there was an advisory group really to grind in and discuss a couple key changes and formed again another advisory group with some of the same membership you see here today and made recommendations and also implemented fees for the wildlife control operators. Let's see. So I'm just going to highlight some of the different things about the rules and then talk about some report summaries, just summarized from recent years' activities. So just wanted a general overview, wanted to just demonstrate that, when a wildlife control operator permit is required. As you can see, it has those issues right there. If there is a fee being charged by a business to do those things that are listed there, then that individual does need a wildlife control operator permit. They work for the client or not necessarily a landowner, could be a renter, but that could be the clients, not necessarily just landowners. And I also wanted to draw that distinction that as we talk about the legislatively defined predatory animal species, if all the activity is limited to addressing those species and it's on site on that landowner's property, an agent conducting that activity does not need a wildlife control operator permit. And the other oversight for that is there can be no live animal transport by anybody except a wildlife control operator, as that has its kind of conditions outlined in the permit. So the purpose of the wildlife control operator rules really looks back to the original intent of that 2004 task force. And it basically kind of outlines that it should apply to wildlife control activities conducted in that city or urban type environments. And you can see that's outlined in the administrative rule under the purpose. There was a number of definitions that were developed into those rules. And just to primarily have them in one place, so as wildlife control operators learn about their program, what they're licensed for, they could find those definitions for the terms used in those rules. Basically, most of those definitions are used elsewhere in the department rules. There were not, outside of just terms that were unique to that program, there was not, redefinition to the terms that we are even discussing in other pieces of our kind of work group discussions. So the permits for WCOs, it clearly outlines, it gives them abilities or what their abilities are with that wildlife control operator permit, allows them to capture, obtain possession of that wildlife, to transport in some cases, and to relocate in some cases. And it has very specifics for, different species, especially native wildlife. So the rules do require humane euthanasia of several species, primarily the prohibited species, non-natives, and has that euthanasia, the reference that they utilize and we refer them to is the AVMA euthanasia guidelines. You can see a CO2 chamber there in the top picture, and that's one of the probably the key items that most of the wildlife control operators prefer, although theirs is a little bit more of a commercial device. That's one that we utilize at one of our field offices. And like I talked about, there is some relocation opportunities that the wildlife control operators can work through our local district offices, particularly with native wildlife. Generally, if they get some of those, that's the target critter that is nuisance wildlife, then they have some prearranged places where they're doing that relocation to. One of the species we get asked a lot, and certainly is a component of the wildlife control operator permit, is bats. Bat control work has very specific guidance under the WCO permit. There are only certain months that they're allowed to do exclusion and eviction activities unless the permittee has already talked with us and discussed some different options with the local district biologists. And those rules clearly define what exclusion and eviction means as they move forward with their business activity. The rules also outline that, and it still allows for someone to, just as a residence, to capture and get a bat back outside that's in the living area of the home. For instance, a bat that may be upstairs, just an unusual situation. That individual, residential individual doesn't need to get a WC permit. And they often are calling the district office, or sometimes they will just get advice from a WCO on the phone. The business side of the rules for the wildlife control operators, like I said, there was an adoption of a permit that was one of the components of the task force was develop and recommend that task or that fee structure for those permits. They're issued to an individual or a business, meaning that the business owner is not required to undertake all the other conditions of actually doing field activities if they're not doing those activities. And that's, it was just to give the full spectrum of some of these are very small businesses. Others, just by virtue, have a business owner that has a number of different operators throughout several counties. There are renewal requirements as well. You can see that there's a built-in component for continuing education credits, or if they lapse, or they could just choose to retake the wildlife control operator test components. Those continuing education credits are various types of conferences where those credits are offered. There's online education options. We, every other year, the department every other year helps them host a conference, the Northwest Wildlife Control Operators, and we give some credit for just getting updated on rule changes and different activities with the department. The permit is valid for 2 years. One thing that all those individuals that are participating as part of that company, they all have to undertake the training manual and pass a test with at least an 80% score. Let's see. And that's, we've been moving a lot of those materials, including even some of the reporting elements now. We're moving to an online platform just to more easily and more seamlessly interact with those wildlife control operators. There's currently about 80 licensed permittees here this year. We had a little bit of an uptick. I don't know whether it was part of COVID or some other things. Most of those were not necessarily new businesses, but more individuals that were participating in existing businesses. The other component of the wildlife control operators is there is a kind of a mentoring opportunity. So companies and individuals that are licensed, they can mentor individuals less than 18 years of age. And those individuals are not required to pay a fee and don't have to pay it or pass the test to be a mentored individual, but would be required to pass that test if they wanted to conduct those activities after they pass the age of 18. So also embedded in the rules, there is specifics on trap checks. In section 25 of our rules, there's a 48-hour trap check time for cage traps or restraining traps. And in most cases, or I would say in all the cases, we really, again, are mirroring the fur taker rules. A wildlife control operator, though, can have a designee such as the landowner or client who would check the traps and make an initial notification to the business owner that there's something in the trap. And that really is just that unique circumstance of, much of this is done right at a residence. Kevin Christensen outlined the challenges of trying to do any kind of wildlife control in an urban environment. And that's one of the key things is just visibility. So that's really a piece of the permit that's emphasized in the training and that relationship with the client. If a wildlife control operator, regardless of that 48-hour trap check, if they are notified by their client or the designee that they have an animal in a trap, they only have 24 hours and they need to get to the trap. In most cases, that 24 hours is usually met very quickly because of the either species that's in the trap, such as a skunk you see, or just in the issue of the other residents that are nearby, or just visibility of the trap, time of year, that sort of thing. There are some other very specific things that are conditioned and outlined as part of trap checks and holding wildlife. That includes that if they one of their target species is a lactating female, they're required to hold that female for 72 hours, to try to see if there are some, or they can use that female, I should say, to lure in the neonates. And if they choose to do that, there are some humane, caging standards that are required for doing that. In those cases, they're also required to have coordination back with the district biologist on some of those activities. Let's see, I think Derek's outlined all the prohibited species, those things. I'm not going to take much more time with that. As I talked about earlier, the humane euthanasia is undertaken for the majority of the wildlife that they interact with, the nuisance wildlife, and I'll show you some of the outcomes or the species that they interact, and you'll see that the majority of those species, nuisance wildlife that they handle, are the part of the unprotected mammals or prohibited species. It does require that if they transport any live wildlife, there are humane care for that transport that are outlined in those rules as well. And again, part of the wildlife control operator training. Just as with the fur taker rules, there is a requirement to label and have identification on all traps that are put out by those businesses. There's also the same protections for trap tampering by other members of the public outside of those designees. And that really became apparent after the first year or so of implementation of the rules, as that was one of the adaptations they made. And it describes that really that only that wildlife control operator or the designee can operate the trap, meaning that there are time periods where in some instances, if temperatures get warm, that wildlife control operator can ask the designee to close the trap. Just all those nuances are covered in the rules as well. And then again, if wildlife is transported, has those humane transport needs and outlines, and that transport is coordinated with the district biologist, usually ahead of time, ahead of even getting that target animal. Let's see, one of the new requirements for all wildlife control activities is that they have a signed document from the landowner or client that just identifies, that they can be there legally and what they're doing there. And that authorizes that wildlife control operator to, as some of the statute points out, act as the agent of that landowner. They keep a copy of that signed affidavit as part of their business records. But they don't submit that to us on their reporting requirements, which is every 6 months they send in their previous 6 months summary to us, and that's required and kept here at our office. Last component of the kind of the business side for those permits is a legal process for cancellation or non-renewal of permit. There's a couple of different things that can happen there. And it does involve the legal side for a contested case if they don't agree with the department's decision to cancel or not renew a permit. But some easy examples of that is failure to, do the reporting requirements or insufficient or inaccurate reports is one of those components for cancellation, as well as convictions of a wildlife violation. And those wildlife violations include all of the wildlife violator compacts. So that includes if they have license, if their hunting, fishing license is canceled in other states, that means that we can also take that action here as a wildlife violator compact state participant. So standard language in that for the wildlife control operators.
Hey,
So what I
Kevin.
want to do now was talk.
How many more slides do you have, Kevin? We're at about 10 after 3.
Just 2. These are the report requirements.
The last 2, okay.
Yep. So what I wanted to do was just make sure I saw a snapshot of that reporting requirement. So these are by species, and I moved the top species until I hit beaver, because that was one of the things we generally had a lot of questions about. How many beaver do wildlife control operators take? So you can see it's a fairly minimal amount of effort or a minimal amount of take. It certainly is more than other species, but the business side of wildlife control operators is really centered around just those first 6 species or so. And again, Jamie will make this available online so people can dig out a little bit more of the information if they choose to do that. And then I wanted to also highlight for the beaver, one of the questions really centered on those current wildlife control operators that we have licensed. They are primarily in Western Oregon. Of course, that corresponds to where the population centers are. So it's not probably that unusual that for reported beaver trapping, the majority of effort by wildlife control operators are in some Western Oregon counties. But you can see on average, yearly average in many of those counties is handfuls of beaver that they're addressing through landowner or different client complaints. So that's all I had, Jamie. And again, she'll make this available to the group. I could take any more questions, but we'll get back on schedule.
Yeah, we've got time for some questions because, our OSP person joined our meeting today just at a last minute, so he doesn't have a presentation. And so we have a little bit of extra time there. So Greg, what questions do you have?
A couple of questions. Kevin, how are you doing?
Real good.
Good. So do you ever encounter, I guess for lack of a better term, renegade or unpermitted people doing wildlife control work, kind of setting up their business outside of the rules? I mean, do you come across people like that?
Commissioner Woolley, we have some, the OSP is the enforcement arm. Generally, if we hear about those instances, then those are reported on to both OSP at that local office there, at a local office, or Rick Boatner works that through the program side to see what that may be. As business operators, generally, most of the information we get on different activity or concerns of activity either come from public complaints, public, questions, or they come from other wildlife control operators who hear about someone went to a residence and they're kind of, they're like the second person that individual resident got a hold of. And then that wildlife control operator reports to us that, hey, I don't know who this business is, but not familiar with them. And then that's how we would track someone down like that. So that's about the most we get involved with some of those, Greg.
Okay. And then could you talk, since Western gray squirrel is way up at the top or close to the top of the most, receiving the most calls about, what sort of damage do they do? Is that to orchards? What's their thing?
Yeah, Commissioner Woolley, that damage, or again, these are primarily nuisance. And so most of the time that is just nuisance wildlife, right there in the yard. maybe any number of different things, but generally not associated with like crop damage or agriculture, that sort of thing.
So just because they exist, because they see them, and then they can just call and have them dispatched, but they're not doing any harm. Is that qualifies as a legitimate call?
Yeah, well, I was looking back on the sheet there that I had, the slide that I put up there. And I think what you saw at the very top is an eastern gray squirrel. So that's the,
okay, eastern.
Yeah, that's the non-native. I looked at the western gray and it's on average about, oh boy, it's probably, there was one year there with a lot of complaints, but it looks like most of the time it's not even 20. So yeah, and of course with the non-native eastern gray squirrel, there, can be a nuisance animal for residents in a lot of different ways, like many of the other non-native species can.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, I meant eastern, and I was just, whether native or non-native, I was just wondering what sort of damage they do.
Yeah, and from the field side, most of the different things we have are really associated with, landscaping and garden damage. Those are a lot of the different issues associated with gray squirrels, eastern gray squirrels.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
Jill?
Yeah, Kevin, you just had the list of that just look like responses that they went and took care of that many different type of animals. Is that correct? As opposed to those are the ones that were killed versus released in your last list?
Yeah, the annual report, that's correct. That's so I did not, other than the take for the beaver there, I did not show the, a lot of times a wildlife control operator may get on scene and it is simply an hour of advice that they charge that landowner for about how to address damage, but it usually is associated, and that individual wildlife control operator would identify what that, the nuisance animal is for them. So
Do they?
I would say for some of the species, it's probably directly, reflective of removal. For instance, on the possum side, a lot of times a landowner doesn't know what the critter was. It just knows there's a problem and has a critter under the house or something, and that's what it turns out to be. What was an opossum.
And does the department receive a report of what they killed versus what they relocated or what they just gave advice on?
Yeah, we have some of those embedded in the full reports that they give. I just did some summaries. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
And Kevin, I see your hand up. Did you have something to add to what Kevin Blakely was presenting? We generally don't.
No, I was trying to
don't take questions from other presenters.
Yeah. No, I'm getting back to my screen there. I lost part of where I could see the chat. So nope, my hand is not up for a question.
Not you, Kevin Blakely. Kevin Christensen has his hand up.
I was just going to try and interject. I can't speak for the wildlife control operators and the data that Kevin Blakely displayed, but we do receive a lot of phone calls and we will refer individuals to use private control operators. And a lot of the calls that we get in these urban areas are the eastern gray squirrel is getting into homes, getting in attic spaces, chewing into sheds, getting into their gardens. That's most often the typical type of damage that we're getting reported to, as I recall off the hand. So.
Thanks, Kevin C. Kevin Blakely, Quinn had a question in the chat. She had some background noise, so she put it in there. The question is, can you tell us how humane is defined in the rules and regs for wildlife control operators?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's what I'm trying to get back to the chat. Quinn, I don't know off the top of my head. I don't think humane is defined in there in our definition section. If we thought there was an overlay of that we needed to emphasize humane care, that's where we generally have things in there, like if they use a neonate to attract in another critter, they have to provide water, they have to provide shade, they have to, so if there were specifics about humaneness, we wanted to make sure that they addressed. We try to give those specifics there rather than just say it's got to be a humane, caging to attract, another critter. So hopefully that answers it enough there.
Quinn, did you have any follow-up? No? Okay.
And I see Jim Sollers had, I thought just raised his hand there. Didn't know if he had a question.
Jim, I missed that.
Yeah. Kevin, in your presentation there, the last two annual reports, can you email those to me? There was something in there I noticed that I wanted to look into. It doesn't relate to our track check issue, but if you could send those two annual reports to me, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, Jim, absolutely. Like I talked about, these presentations that we make, they'll be part of, the public record. So Jamie will have those distributed. Those are some summaries. So, we can certainly talk about and can interact offline about some other species that maybe you didn't see on the list or did see. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin and Kevin. So why don't we switch gears just a bit here, and since we have Isaac with OSP with us, recognizing that he got tagged for this task this morning because they were talking with internally about who was available and who could be here. And Isaac, you've got a bit of a flavor now, I think, of the group, given some of the questions and the conversation that's occurred around the two topics today so far. And I understand you don't have a presentation prepared, but I know that we did send you a few questions in advance. And so if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Isaac, and give just a little background about OSP Wildlife Division, and then answer the questions that we sent you.
Sure. So thank you. My name is Isaac Sear. I'm a sergeant with the Oregon State Police Fish and Wildlife Division, and I'm stationed in Baker City. The Oregon State Police has a division specifically tasked with enforcing the fish and wildlife laws in the state of Oregon, to include the trapping laws. And that work is done by approximately 120 fish and wildlife troopers spread around the state. So I was asked to specifically talk to some bullet points that were sent to me. So I'll just kind of cover those, and then can answer questions if any come up. So in relation to monitoring trap checks, Oregon Fish and Wildlife Troopers monitor trap checks by conducting patrols focused on trapping and trapping enforcement. These patrols are typically done on public land and premises open to the public. Our troopers would need permission from landowners to patrol any private land or to address trapping issues on private property. Our patrols are conducted several different ways. All the Fish and Wildlife Troopers have a Fish and Wildlife patrol truck. Patrols could also be done on ATVs, tracked ATVs, snow machines. We have used aircraft before for trapping saturations, and as well as boats. In relation to the trap check requirements during our patrols, we do come across trappers that are sometimes out of compliance on the 48-hour check. And depending on the circumstances, that can be handled with a warning and some education, or a citation, depending on the circumstances. One thing I did note here, often in these instances, we hear from the trapper referring to the trap check requirements for predatory animals that are set forth in ORS 610-002, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which does not apply to the fur bearers and unprotected mammals. And sometimes that is a source of confusion, and sometimes it's also an excuse. So we have to kind of decipher that. I was asked to speak about compliance. Compliance is just like anything else, like in fishing or hunting, trapping. You have the people that follow the rules. You have the people that make an honest effort to follow the rules and maybe make a mistake. And then you have the people that are out there that intentionally break the law. You know, we use our discretion, our training experience to kind of decipher that and kind of where we land on enforcement. Our officer time spent on trapping enforcement is recorded in our time activity system that we utilize. Typically what will be captured in there is the hours spent working a certain unit for a certain species for trapping enforcement. And then if we contacted a trapper, the compliance of the trapper and that check. Often we work trapping stuff where the trapper is not contacted. You know, we may work a trap line and find that everything is legitimate and compliant, and there's no reason for a face-to-face contact with the trapper. Let's see here. I was asked to identify some challenges. Challenges for some of the Fish and Wildlife troopers, maybe some of the more less tenured ones can be locating trap checks. And so we do get some training. Like Stan Steele mentioned, he's a trainer, and we also have some ODFW trainers that train us at in-services and help us identify areas to look, sets to look for, methods, those types of things. You know, there's no requirement in Oregon for, you know, a licensed trapper to indicate where their trap sets are. So, you know, we have to use our knowledge of trapping and our knowledge from year to year on where traps have been in the past, and also our knowledge of, you know, where specific wildlife is in related to, you know, what they might be trapping, you know, looking in certain habitats for, say, people that are trapping bobcats or whatnot. Unbranded traps can be a challenge at times. The rules say that, you know, trappers have to have their traps branded. And if they're not branded, it can be challenging to find the individual that's associated with the trap. And then also a challenge that we have come across is conflict between trappers and other user groups, whether they're dog walkers or bird hunters or what have you. You know, the interface of the different groups out there on the landscape. I was asked to speak about some common violations. I mentioned unbranded traps, sight bait within 15 feet of, you know, foothold traps set for carnivores, improper jaw spacing, using the flesh of game birds, game fish, or game mammals for trap bait, disturbance of lawful traps set by trappers, and this would be a disturbance by other user groups. We have had issues with that, and that's unlawful for people to disturb a licensed trapper's traps. And then there can be record card violations for bobcat and river otter harvest. And then we do have trespass issues, private landowners that report, you know, trapping on their property that wasn't permitted. I was asked if the number of animals, non-target animals are trapped, you know, how many animals and non-target animals are trapped in each of the different user categories. Enforcement doesn't keep track of take. I would defer to ODFW on that, and they do have, fur taker harvest reports. So some information could probably be gleaned from that. So, and I was asked to provide some incidental takes, and of course takes and or captures, and I can only speak to, what I have seen over the years, and some of the non-target captures that I've seen over the years, as deer, raptors, cougars, wolves, and domestic dogs, cats, those types of things. So I think that's it for me. If anyone has any questions, feel free.
Yeah, thank you so much, Isaac. Stan, was there a minute or two about training that you wanted to add? You're on mute. You are muted.
Am I there now?
Yep, there you are.
Okay, so thank you, Jamie, Sergeant, Commissioner Woolley, and work group members. First, let me say that I really was proud to serve Oregon for 25 years with Oregon State Police Fish and Wildlife Division. Probably the best trained fish and wildlife or conservation enforcement agency in the States. Really are an incredible group of people. It has always been the priority of the department to provide the best training possible to enable a high detection rate and compliance with all the trapping regulations. Classroom instruction and field exercises are conducted periodically to refresh detection and enforcement techniques at both annual in-service training or initial instruction to Fish and Wildlife troopers. Trapping consists of best management practices, Oregon fur bearer trapping and hunting regulations, and actual trapping scenarios, so that trappers gain the knowledge to detect trap sets, determine what sets target species are actually set for, and make sure that the set and thereby the trapper is in compliance with Oregon's rules and regulations. There's no question that expertise provided to our troopers can turn them into very effective field enforcement personnel, and they are. Unbranded traps, for example, I'm just going to give you a real brief on how we would look at unbranded traps and say, how can a trooper really detect whether the trap's branded or not? Traps are often dyed, waxed, in other words, trying to have scent removal, and wax oftentimes makes the trap more efficient, which ensures less impact to the animal when it's actually captured, in other words, foot placement in the capture. But oftentimes this process of dyeing and waxing covers up what is required as a legible brand. So we show them techniques of how to find the brand on a trap. And oftentimes that's just as simple as actually scratching the flat surfaces and finding the 4-digit brand. Site bait is another one that's very, very important to us. Site bait regulations were put in to make sure that avian species were not captured. So there's restrictions that are used on site bait, and site bait can be very effective, but can also be hard to detect. And so that type of training goes on. Catch circles, which would give these guys an indicator that a trap was set there. This is the type of in-depth training that they must have to be very, very effective field officers. And we've got some great ones. I'd love to have some questions. I've been training them for over 25 years now. And the main reason we want training is that we can have strict compliance with Oregon's rules and regulations.
Thanks, Dan. So folks, what questions do you have? We can take a few questions before we need to move into the finalizing the charter and talking about our next work group meeting. Jill? Jill, it's always you're muted still. Yep, I know.
Difficult. Anyway, thank you, Stan and Sergeant Sear, and also APHIS folks for all the presentations. I have just a question for either Stan or Sergeant, has a trooper ever been caught in a trap when he was trying to examine where, for instance, what the brand was?
Sergeant, you want me to go?
Sure, Stan, go ahead, and then I can follow up if needed.
Okay, thank you. So these traps, you know, I think that might be a kind of a misnomer. They're not so huge that there's actually going to be a capture of a foot or even a hand. So we do teach them how to turn over the trap, and you can actually deactivate or set the trap off without having to have any type of, you know, hands or even feet, or feet can actually be the tool that's used. With the killing device traps, that it can be more problematic, but there are ways to actually, we show them where the safety catches are, how to put those safety catches on the springs, and then when you dislodge the trigger mechanism, there's actually very little impact, so it can be done with a stick or whatever. So great question, because safety is something that we want to make sure we talk to the troops about.
Okay, thank you.
Greg?
Question for Sergeant Sear, and I know a lot of our troopers work, majority is involved with forcing, hunting, and angling regulations. So I was just wondering what percentage of time you actually spend monitoring trap lines, and then what percent of them do you think you actually encounter? And I know this is just approximate. I'm not looking for any kind of exact data, but just kind of your how much of that time is spent on this sort of work, and what's percentage of the ones that you feel like you actually see or don't see when you're out?
Sure. So first question, you know, how much time do we spend on that? Kind of as I mentioned earlier, you know, those hard numbers can be determined from our statistical programs that we use to capture officer time. I can only kind of speak to my area, but over here in Eastern Oregon, kind of at the conclusion of the big game seasons is kind of when a lot of our trapping stuff really kicks off, and we do spend a fair amount of our time working on trapping issues because you know, that is the type of work that is going on that type of year. So it's not uncommon for an officer over here in Eastern Oregon to spend a large amount of their time, you know, in those months after big game seasons are over to address trapping. That's not to say that trapping enforcement and issues aren't worked other times of the year, but we do spend a large amount of time in late fall into winter on trapping enforcement. And as far as the number of trappers that we encounter or traps out on the landscape, that's a very difficult question to answer. So I don't know if I'd even begin to give you a number there.
Yeah, I wasn't really asking for a
oh.
number. I just simply was wondering if you see that because I don't know if you called out ahead of time to look for specific trap lines that you're aware of, or if you're just patrolling in general and seeing what you encounter. I'm not really clear on the process.
Sure. Kind of as Stan mentioned earlier, part of the training that we receive is, you know, learning like trap set locations and what to look for, where to patrol. And once you get that training and start working in trapping enforcement, you really get a feel for where to look. and then you start finding trap set locations, and officers will remember from year to year where certain trap lines were, and they'll go back to those areas, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those traps will be in the same areas year after year after year, but some areas are quite commonly used from one year to the next. It might not be the same trapper, but it could be another trapper. So basically, using your knowledge of trapping and the training that you received, you get pretty good at knowing where to go and what to look for. It's not just kind of driving around. It's more of a focused patrol of going out and to those locations and finding those trap sets.
Okay. So you're saying you feel that an experienced trooper does encounter most of the traps that are in their area or in their district?
Well, I mean,
Go ahead.
That's hard to quantify because unless you know what that number is, I don't know how you would determine that. But I would say, an experienced trooper doesn't have a difficult time finding traps on the landscape and enforcing, the trapping rules.
And Greg, if I could interrupt, what I was going to say is when we were working with the Wildlife Division to bring Sergeant Sear in today, everybody recognized that they didn't have a lot of time to really prepare, and so that they said they'd be happy to come back, and they're also pulling together some statistics to share. And so some of the statistics and facts, Isaac's a little flat-footed to share.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm just trying to get a sense of it, not any specific numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I will also say that, for the most part, our patrols are focused on public lands and premises open to the public. Depending on your area, you may be patrolling some private lands with permission for, trapping enforcement. But if we don't have permission from a private landowner to patrol their property for trapping enforcement, then we don't, obviously. So, there is a lot of trapping that occurs on private lands that, we may not check.
Right.
So
Okay.
thanks, Greg, and thanks, Isaac. Quinn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Stan, and thank you, Sergeant Sear, so much for your presentations. I have a question that's probably for both of you, and it's how much discretion do officers have when evaluating, a situation on the ground, in terms of issuing a citation or some other kind of penalty? Stan, I was struck by the example you gave, right, where maybe there's a trap and the markings have been covered up, which may be technically a violation, but it's clear, the trapper was, I think, responsibly in good faith and all of that. How does an officer on the ground deal with those situations, and how much discretion do you all have?
A great question for the sergeant, Quinn. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So as far as discretion, troopers have discretion in all the work that we do out there, whether it's in fisheries or the hunting or the trapping. And, through our training and experience, you kind of learn, what people's intent is and what their intent wasn't. So I would say troopers have a lot of discretion when it comes to making a decision on enforcement. And if they happen to have questions on where to go with that, then obviously, they have their supervisors to, tap and ask, their opinion. As far as, the fines and penalties and whatnot that are assessed, we obviously write what, is set in statute. And then we know when those cases go to court, it's up to, some of it is up to the DA's office. And then, of course, the courts and whatnot of how those fines and penalties are assessed in the end. And really, depending on the case, it could go, a lot of different ways.
So Quinn, if I could just add, several years ago, there was a situation in Northeast Oregon on trap check intervals. And we actually wrote a letter to the court requesting a very stiff adjudication, a very stiff fine. So we felt it was a relatively egregious. And so once again, it was one of those situations where we do want strict compliance.
Thank you both.
Kelly, and then I'll have this be our last question for this segment so we can get to the last little bit of our agenda.
Great, and thank you so much. And I guess this would be a question for Stan or Sergeant Searan. Thank you so much. How do you go about enforcing between, the 7-day, 76 hours to 7 days? What factors do you weigh in if there is a trapper in violation of, let's say, because typically the trap check time is 76 hours for coyotes or predatory animals. But if it's for damage, it would be 7 days. And I'm assuming most of that's on private land. So I just wanted to, that's an open-ended question for either of you.
What the actual 76 days is the predatory statute.
76 hours versus 7 days.
6 hours. That is going to be on that. It doesn't appear that those would be for public lands. Those would be on private lands.
So that would be hard to enforce.
Well, if they were on public lands, it would fall within the 48-hour classification.
For coyotes?
Yes.
Okay. And then I guess that leads me to, I think Sergeant indicated there is some confusion out there in the field about trap check times.
So I can answer to that.
Okay.
So on public land, per the ORS 498-172, the traps set for fur-bearing mammals and unprotected wildlife need to be checked every 48 hours. So when an individual is trapping on public land, those species, it has to be every 48 hours. And what I'm speaking to as far as the confusion is in the Oregon fur bearer trapping and hunting regulations, they identify both of those trap check requirements depending on where the trapper is operating and what they're trapping out there. And so I will point out on the public land, the unprotected mammals will be coyotes. So that even on public land, you have to check your traps every 48 hours for coyotes. And so I guess my comment was, if an individual was not checking it every 48 hours for a coyote on public land, you may hear them try and use the excuse that they thought it was every 76. And that could be legitimate, or that could be someone that's trying to skirt the rules.
Thank you. Well, thank you,
And
Sergeant
it's
Isaac. Oh, go ahead, Sergeant.
Oh, I
Sear,
was
go
just
ahead.
going to say, on private, like you mentioned there, private land, unless we have, open access, i.e. an invitation from the landowner to patrol their area for trapping enforcement, then yes, that would be very difficult to monitor that stuff. But as I mentioned before, we do work with landowners that are happy to have us come out and work on their property for trapping enforcement. And as I mentioned before too, we get calls from landowners that are concerned about traps that have been set on their property that aren't necessarily haven't been permitted or are not abiding by the rules. So.
Well, thank you, Sergeant Steer, and thank you, Stan, for sharing with the group information about enforcement and training. Appreciate those perspectives, and we may have further conversations about this. So, so with that, I need to move us to just our last couple of agenda items, and we're really close to finalizing the charter. We've talked about it now at 2 meetings, and there's just a few little outstanding items with regard to the charter that it would be good to clarify. And so, Sam, do we want to go ahead and put that up on the screen? And while Sam is putting it up on the screen, one of the clarification questions we had last time that we didn't settle is this question about, is the scope of this work group looking at fur bearer and predator trap check times only, or all mammals under ODFW jurisdiction? And the reason why this is still unsettled is we had some conversation about, is the all mammals under ODFW jurisdiction too large of a scope at this time? I think we heard from Derek talking about that. That might be just a much larger conversation to have, and maybe we start here with fur bearer and predator, and then see where we go. So that was one. And then also there are the sort of the unintended consequences of having a much larger scope because of the number of other species that are brought into the discussion. I know that Quinn, I think it was Quinn, had brought up, or maybe it was Kelly or Quinn had brought up concerns about game animals, so specifically black bear, and whether or not we would be taking those on as a part of this conversation. So I don't know, ODFW and Commission, if you've had a chance to noodle on those since our last meeting, or if you have any other direction for us about that, because that is one piece that is a little bit unsettled about our scope. Anybody? Jill?
Yeah, I don't believe that the commission was thinking about game animals and probably didn't even know about game animal trapping when they were considering this, because it came up during the fur bearer rule setting, or season setting. So I think, to me, it's following the, including fur bearers, predatory animals in this only. And if at some point it brings us to go further, but I think I would like to see it kept to fur bearers and predatory animals.
Greg?
So how many more animals would we be talking about if we were talking about game animals? I mean, I think if the concern, one of the major concerns or the main concern is humaneness, it seems like we would be covering any animal that could be caught in a trap. So how much of an enlargement of the scope would that be? And what are the implications of that, or what are the problems with that?
Yeah, Jamie, this is Kevin. I unmuted myself. I can weigh in a little bit maybe. So mammals under the authority, particularly game mammals, wolves, for example, is a game mammal. It start discussing things that, we currently have no, trapping season on in regards to what I think we were really trying to put the scope and original discussion on. So it does get complicated, and I would say I'd agree with Jill that it probably dilutes some initial conversation and direction that we were heading. But I, don't mind at all if we get to some of those discussions and they're needed and a group wants to have some of that, then we can talk about that. But game mammals does, encompass, deer, elk, cougar, bear, wolves. It's a number of things.
Yeah. So for instance, bear are also nuisance animals, right? They cause damage and they are trapped. So I think that's why they entered into the conversation. You know, are there any rules around trapping for bears, and do they follow the same rules, the same requirements for humaneness as other animals? I think that's part of the question. And, you know, does this committee have any responsibility for that, or is that just something completely separate that has to be addressed with a different body?
Tyler, and then Kelly.
Yeah, I can briefly say, I think I concur with Commissioner Zarnowitz that we need to keep our scope fairly streamlined, especially if we're going to be wrapping this thing up by the end of the year.
Kelly?
See if I can unmute. You know, I guess it goes back to a comment I think that was directed to me if we're talking about apples and oranges. We're talking about wild animals, animals that are trapped. They're managed and protected by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I feel privileged to be part of a work group talking about, you know, humane treatment and responsible trap check times. And I would say that Oregon's wildlife deserve a consistent conversation about the length of time that they can be in a trap, regardless of their definition. Black bears in particular, I don't know the number of wildlife services. I guess we didn't ask them. They would probably have that, since I think they do most of the trapping for timber damage. The last I looked, it was close to 200 that year. That is a game mammal that ODFW has a black bear management plan. They have hunting seasons for. Would seem that ODFW, I'm just going to say, would want to set something in rule that protects them further, and it's a clear line. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Kelly. Marianne?
Yeah, and I apologize. I had to hit the road, so I am not on video. But I guess I would say a couple things. I remember, I think Derek had mentioned if we broaden the scope out to mammals, obviously there's some marsupials that I think fall under the predatory animal definition that aren't, that wouldn't be covered. And once we get into game animals, I just feel like that is a whole different conversation, a whole different set of regulations. And quite frankly, not what I thought the commission had in mind. And so it also seems like if we're going to do that broadening, that should go back in front of the commission for a vote, because they are the ones that set our charge. And so I would prefer to keep it narrow in the interest of actually getting through the work, because if we're starting parts out, you know, on a species by species or animal by animal basis, we might be here for a few more years, and that is one option, but I think that would drain the commission's budget pretty quickly too. So anyways, I would like to stick to the original scope as at least I understood it from the commission.
Kelly?
I want to add, I know when I testified before the commission during the fur bearing regs, I definitely mentioned, it's in my testimony, that black bears, there are no trap check times for black bears. That has also been something that has been introduced in the legislature in making our trap check times, even for game mammals, 24 hours. So I totally respect the decision that is made collectively here. But what I would say is, in comparing where states are on their trap check times, those that are 24 hours to 36, they don't have differing trap check times. Even those that are game mammals are subject to the same trap check time. So and they aren't just the eastern states. There's states like Arizona, Colorado, Washington, Kentucky, Minnesota, and so on. So again, I feel like, do we need to have another trap check work group? Do we want to go through that to talk about black bears and game mammals? This seems like the opportunity to do that when everyone's together. So.
Thanks, Kelly. So we're coming up to the top of the hour, it doesn't look like, I mean, we've heard from the commissioners that, or at least from Jill, that she's interested in us keeping to the current scope of the fur bearer and predator focus. And, you know, like I had said at previous meetings, I mean, this group can come up with recommendations for future work that needs to be done. And so if this group decides to not take on the game animal side of things, as Kelly is talking about, the group could recommend as a part of recommendations that ODFW should go there, and that then here's what it would look like, or here's what to consider. So that is just another thought. We've got a couple of hands up. So Bob just put in the chat, I agree with Kelly. I think we should include game animals as well. And Kim or Quinn, you raised your hand. Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah, I think, and Jamie, I know I sent this question to you and to Sam, and that was to have some clarification with this group about what the actual authority of the commission is to change trap check times, if that's what this group decides is appropriate at this time. And, you know, the thing that feels a little inconsistent to me is that, you know, we have some time intervals that are set by statute, and it is unclear to me what action the commission could take. Whereas, you know, with game animals, we have a situation where it's more directly under the commission's purview. So to me, that's a consideration, is where can the commission act? And if the goal here is to create more consistency, it seems maintaining those things that are under the commission's direct purview is important.
So I would suggest that we're not going to be able to resolve this in the minute or two that we have left, that we don't even have left in this meeting, and that we just, so trying to figure out a good way to, it seems to me that we need to have that we should have a conversation with the commissioners to clarify this and bring a proposal back. That would be the best. That's the best course of action I can think of to do at this point. I think that, you know, folks have weighed in, and we heard the couple of sides of what we should be doing, and I think we need to spend more time on it. So I know that might not be satisfying, but I think it's better than trying to cram something through in a shorter period of time that we have. So the last thing that I wanted to bring forward is our next meeting, which is September 14th. We are still in this little bit of a limbo about whether or not it'll be in person. I know we were on track to meet in person, but now we have some new constraints around in-person meetings. And so more to come on that. I think everybody's in the same boat on that. The couple of agenda items that seem to rise to the surface in terms of this stage that we're in, which is information sharing, are ones that were raised were, I'm calling it the trapping technology, kind of the best practices, technology of trapping, range of traps, what they are, what they do, those kinds of things, and also animal welfare and what the issues are related, you know, with different kinds of trapping, different kinds of practices related to animal welfare. So those were two topics that seem to be ripe for this information sharing stage that we're in right now. And then I would say probably at our later meeting in September, we should start moving towards, you know, okay, we've got an information base. What are the choices? What are the options? And what is that based on? And start moving in that direction. But I'd be interested to know if what people think about those two topics for our September meeting, and that I would be reaching out to people on the work group about how to put those two topics together. So first, just what do people think about those two topics for September? Any thoughts? We just make it happen, Jim? Marianne, you're breaking up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jim.
Yeah, I'm all for the BMPs, best management practices. We worked on that for years, and I think it needs to be brought forward.
Okay, and then that also includes kind of what I'm calling trapping technology, sort of how things have changed. What are the what are the options and available? What's available now? Yeah, so that whole body of work, and then the other body of work is around animal welfare. And I know when I was looking at the APHIS website, one of APHIS's missions is animal welfare too. And I think they kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways, because the best management practices in some ways is to respond to animal welfare concerns. And so those are the two topics that I was thinking about for September. Marianne, are you back in a place where we can hear you?
Yeah, I think it was just because I was like started to talk and then forgot to raise my hand, and it was my voice and not my technology. On the animal welfare topic, I guess the topics make sense to me, but my comment is making sure that we frame that up in a way that is kind of relevant to this issue. I know just from my general ag experience, animal welfare can be a topic with as many perspectives as there probably are people in our work group. And so, I think I would focus in on animal welfare as it relates to this activity, because I worry without, I guess, close constraints or close containment that topic could become a little bit of a battle of experts or something like that. And I'm not sure that serves very many people.
Okay, thank you for that, Marianne. I so noted. That's partly why I bundled it together with the best management practices and the trapping technology side of it, because that does help us to stay focused, but it also helps us to understand what what options there are out there and what that starts to look like from an animal perspective as well as a trapper perspective. And so that's partly why I framed it that way. Any other thoughts on those topics, knowing that I'm going to be reaching out to people on this group to help us form the conversation? Okay. And thank you all for spending just a couple minutes past. Tyler, what's up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with those two topics. I think, like you said, the best management practices and animal welfare go kind of together. And I think it's mentioned 50 times in a couple of publications. But I also just wanted to throw out an idea. I think maybe some of these agendas are overly aggressive. And I certainly think we need to nail down our charter as well. I'm definitely in favor of make sure all the information's out there before we solidify the charter, but getting it a little bit closer. I think we're still quite a ways away from finalizing that charter. So maybe toning it down just a little bit might be
maybe for our next, yeah. So the options for our next meeting are we could meet a little bit longer, or we could just have one combined conversation and then a little bit on the, getting that charter closed out. I agree, we are packing a lot in. So with that, we are a few minutes over, and yeah, so our next meeting is on the 14th. I'll be reaching out to folks about working on what that panel will look like, and I would, there are a few outstanding items on the charter, but mostly we think we are a lot closer than I think people give credit. And so if there's any other thoughts on the charter, you can certainly reach out to us, because we'd like to get that closed out as well. So with that, I don't want to keep you any further. Anything else for the good of the order? All right, well, next time I see you all, I will be a grandma. So there we go. On that note.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest.